Starting off with the Pentomic Division. The Pentomic Division was created for the atomic battlefield, although it had a lack of sustainability and also manpower. The technology they used wasn't very well developed. They couldn't really support the concept, and it was irrelevant for any type of other scenario that you might deal with in war. Basically, it was a bunch of small people spread out, small groups of people spread out, because whenever a bomb hits, you don't want a concentration of large amount of people in one area. So for the atomic battlefield, they had this idea of using a pentomic division, small group of people spread out over a large area. But they didn't really have a lot of technology, and to sustain that kind of tactic, due to lack of communication, lack of logistical support at the time, also since the technology wasn't very well developed to deal with that, it was not a very sustainable idea, and it got scrapped pretty soon and replaced with something else that we're going to talk about. So around this time period, between the 1950s to 1960s, there was a lot of unrest on the domestic front, locally here at home. So the president put the National Guard units under federal control. Here's an example in history where the National Guard was called up to federal orders, and the president had control over them because they were on federal orders. This is because of the 1950s to 1960s. They had a lot of unrest. Some of the examples they talk about are in Little Rock, Arkansas, and at the University of Mississippi, where they had problems dealing with the very controversial ideas going on with desegregation and that sort of thing. So, what does the Pentomic Division get replaced with? It gets replaced with the Road Division. The Road Division is this idea of returning back to the triangular structure. Remember from the previous lessons, the triangular structure is like 3 regiments, 3 companies, 3 battalions, 3 platoons. It comes in threes, and that's to allow it to be more flexible and more easily deployable. So here the Road Division is something that's more sustainable, and it's something that's more practical and has more practical applications to different scenarios on the battlefield. So it's more flexible, and with the help of more conventional combat technology, it can be applied to various situations. So the thing about Road Division is that it applies to multiple different types of scenarios on the battlefield, right? It's flexible, multifaceted. Then there was also the Air Mobile Division that was created. It was the idea of improving helicopters for battlefield, because when you improve helicopters and incorporate helicopters into battle, it really helps you to monopolize on mass and maneuver. As we'll see when we talk about Vietnam. So the Diem government had COIN-related problems. Now, COIN stands for counterinsurgency, typically dealing with the Viet Cong and guerrilla-type warfare. They created what's called strategic hamlets, which was a really good idea, but it was bad implementation, typically because they didn't have the logistical support they needed because of how bad things were in Vietnam. They specify here what's testable to know about strategic hamlets. The takeaway is that the strategic hamlet program was a good counterinsurgency idea that had problems. It's important, as evidenced by the fact that the Viet Cong saw the program as a serious threat to political control of the countryside and focused more against the hamlets than other objectives. So the Viet Cong see that this is a pretty significant threat, the strategic hamlets. However, there's one problem with implementing the strategic hamlets. In the South Vietnamese army protection was really weak. They couldn't really stand on their own. So America wasn't getting much help from the South Vietnamese army. Their protection was too weak. They were also too isolated, these hamlets. They were too isolated. They were too far spread apart with not enough people to sustain them, not enough manpower. Additionally, the local militias in South Vietnam were not trained enough, and they didn't have the weaponry to sustain this tactic known as strategic hamlets. And then lastly, there wasn't much support for the program from people that lived in South Vietnam. So the strategic hamlets, while it was a good idea and the Viet Cong saw it as a significant threat, it wasn't able to be sustained because South Vietnamese army was not strong, local militias didn't have the arms to sustain this, and the hamlets were too isolated. One tactic that was used a lot in Vietnam is offensive sweeps used to secure borders. And while they're doing offensive sweeps securing borders, they also conduct counterinsurgency, which is done mostly by local forces like the South Vietnamese army and their local militias. However, like we just said, the South Vietnamese army was weak and the local militias were not very well trained. So you can't really depend on the South Vietnamese to take care of counterinsurgency, so the U.S. forces had to deal with counterinsurgency mostly on their own, which kind of made them really spread out very thin because they had so much going on at once between dealing with counterinsurgency and also offensive sweeps to secure borders. So, what to know here, the offensive sweeps used to secure borders, that's done by like the regular army. You've got kind of two different types of wars going on in Vietnam. You've got the offensive sweeps used to secure the borders done by the regular army. Meanwhile, you've got other parts of the U.S. Army dealing with counterinsurgency, which is a completely different type of battle tactic. Counterinsurgency is more guerrilla warfare type fighting. So that's the difference you should know between counterinsurgency and the tactic of using offensive sweeps to secure borders. Alright, so for this slide, what's important to know, it's hard to see the slide because this picture is blocking what's in red, but basically know that all the areas that they were fighting in all had different enemies, different terrain, different environments, and therefore they all required different tactics. So this slide's kind of chaotic, but we're going to go through it. So this is basically highlighting what we just talked about in the last slide, about the different environments and different tactics. So in La Drang, you have to know La Drang. In La Drang, the U.S. used air mobile units. These are the helicopters we talked about. Then in Doc To, it was in the Highlands. Again, we're using air mobile units in Doc To, but different terrain. And then counterinsurgency had to be used to fight the Viet Cong in Binh Dinh. And then for Operation Cedar Falls, understand that counterinsurgency had to be conducted along with conventional sweeps. So these are kind of examples of the different tactics that had to be used in these four different areas based on the different terrain and different enemies they were facing. This is probably the most intricate slide to read. It's important to read the details here for this one to understand what's going on. And so in the notes it tells you what is testable. Overall, you want to know that the purpose of these four battles is to show how there's different terrain and different enemy situations in each battlefield, which leads to different tactics being used. Understand that the air mobile units is highlighted to reinforce the fact that the air mobile division and its warfighting concept was really successful in Vietnam. So here in Vietnam, we start using helicopters to enhance our use of mass and maneuver on the battlefield, and that's very effective in Vietnam. So the air mobile units were very effective in Vietnam. Understand that. Here, what's testable. In Doc To, they used airborne infantry. Again, the fight occurred in the Highlands, this time near the northwest border. However, for the class, they're going to talk about how there were many sweeps and battles, and they also say there was a lingering Viet Cong threat in Binh Dinh province near the coast. So in Binh Dinh, because the Viet Cong are, what's the big problem there, In Bin Din, we go to counterinsurgency, so fighting guerrilla-type warfare. We're not using the type of air mobile units and airborne infantry like we see in Dak To and La Drang. Now we're doing counterinsurgency to fight the Viet Cong in Bin Din. So that's the difference between Bin Din and the others that we just talked about. So testable here is that the terrain was relatively flat, and the book's going to talk about how areas north and west of Saigon were infested with the Viet Cong guerrilla insurgents, and yet in Operation Cedar Falls, the Army used a conventional sweep operation instead of counterinsurgency tactics. So know that in Operation Cedar Falls, instead of using typical counterinsurgency where you're doing guerrilla-type warfare, now they're doing conventional sweeps, meaning they're using regular army to secure the border, right? It's not so much guerrilla warfare as it is regular army fighting in conventional sweeps to secure borders. So in Operation Cedar Falls, you're not doing guerrilla type warfare against the Viet Cong. Instead, you're doing conventional sweeps to secure borders. And this, of course, was because the Viet Cong in the area, understanding that the Viet Cong were infesting Cedar Falls, which led to Operation Cedar Falls, and the Viet Cong were also infesting Bin Din. And even though regular army did this conventional sweep tactic in Operation Cedar Falls, it was pretty successful. However, it was disappointing. It wasn't completely successful because a lot of the Viet Cong were able to escape, and they were able to return later. So Operation Cedar Falls wasn't a complete success because a lot of the Viet Cong escaped, and they were able to fight again in the future. So Operation Cedar Falls failed to take out all the Viet Cong. But understand the differences between the different types of warfare here. La Drang, we see air mobile units. Dak To, we see up in the highlands, they're using airborne infantry. We're using counterinsurgency to fight guerrilla-type warfare against the Viet Cong in Bin Din. And then in Operation Cedar Falls, we're using conventional sweeps to secure borders. However, a lot of the Viet Cong escaped and were able to fight again another day. So it wasn't totally successful. Alright, so what's most important to know about what we just talked about? For the Pentomic, Road, and Air Mobile divisions, and the wars for each division was designed to fight, were they all applicable to fighting in Vietnam? So Road and Air Mobile divisions were applicable, right? The Road, where you use the triangular divisions, where you have flexible, deployable units, all in threes, 3 regiments, 3 companies, 3 platoons. Road and air mobile divisions were very applicable to Vietnam. However, Pentomic was not. Pentomic was not sustainable. It was only applicable to nuclear war, and even for nuclear war, it wasn't really a good plan, so they scrapped it. So Pentomic was not applicable to Vietnam. Then, as the Vietnam War began in the 1960s, did South Vietnam's coin measures like strategic hamlets have problems? Yes, remember the strategic hamlets were a good idea, but they had problems because the South Vietnam army was weak and couldn't sustain, they couldn't exploit the victories that the U.S. was making, so the strategic hamlets weren't really practical. Also, the local militia in South Vietnam wasn't well trained, they didn't really have good weapons, so they couldn't hold all the land that the U.S. was gaining. So the strategic hamlets had these problems because South Vietnam, their army was not very good, and that made strategic hamlets not so practical. Then, did South Vietnam's later coin efforts exploit the success of big U.S. Army sweeps? So they tried, right? But like I just said, the army wasn't that great in South Vietnam, so they struggled to exploit the successes of all the victories that the U.S. was winning, basically, because South Vietnam's army wasn't strong enough to stand on its own, and any time the U.S. Army claimed land or made headway, the South Vietnamese army failed to then keep that land under control. It was kind of like playing whack-a-mole. They talk about any time the U.S. Army hit a mole and it went down, then somewhere else where they were previously, the moles come back up, right? The Viet Cong comes back in, takes the land back, and the South Vietnamese army wasn't able to stop them. So the U.S. is pretty much on their own in Vietnam, is what you need to understand. Then, regarding terrain, type of enemy forces, and required tactics for the South Vietnam Corps areas different or the same. So they were all different, right? All South Vietnam Corps areas were different. As for the conditions within the core areas, those were all different too. The conditions within the core areas were all different, and the core areas themselves were all different. So, Vietnam, all the environments, all the areas where they were fighting were very diverse. There's a lot of diversity here. They're all different, and even within those areas, there's differences. It's just different, different, different. Then for the U.S., the La Drang, Bin Din, Dak To, and Operation Cedar Falls required the same tactical approach? No, it required all different tactics. For La Drang, if you remember, they used air mobile divisions, and then for Dak To, they used airborne infantry. For Bin Din, they had to use counterinsurgency to fight against the Viet Cong, because that's where they were really heavily infested there in Bin Din. And then for Operation Cedar Falls, they're still fighting against the Viet Cong because the Viet Cong were infesting Cedar Falls. However, they used conventional sweeps, which is more of like a regular army type, non-guerrilla warfare type of fighting, but they're trying to secure their borders. And that really hurt the Viet Cong, but it wasn't totally successful because a lot of the Viet Cong escaped and they were able to come back later. And then as for Westmoreland's dilemma. So Westmoreland's dilemma, basically, to sum it up, it was that he had to choose whether he was going to use counterinsurgency to fight guerrilla-type warfare against the Viet Cong, or whether he was going to use conventional sweeps to secure the borders. If he dedicated all of his people to doing conventional sweeps to secure borders, then he wouldn't have enough people to fight against guerrilla tactics that the Viet Cong were using. So if you use all your regular army to do conventional sweeps and secure borders, then you don't have enough people to fight against the Viet Cong and protect the villages. On this other side of the token, if you do only counterinsurgency measures and you're only fighting the guerrilla warfare tactics of the Viet Cong, then you don't have enough people to secure the borders, and then everything falls apart again because the enemy's going to come in. There's no border security. The Viet Cong will be able to come in, and so there's no security. So Westmoreland's dilemma was basically trying to find a balance between doing counterinsurgency and also conventional sweeps to secure the borders of the lands that they were fighting in. They go into great detail into this dilemma because it is important. We'll see the notes down here about what's important about Westmoreland's dilemma. Westmoreland's dilemma was that if he dispersed forces for counterinsurgency, he could not mass them to handle stronger North Vietnamese army units, and if he concentrated on conventional fighting, he could not disperse forces and focus upon counterinsurgency and the population. So what I just said, right? If you use conventional sweeps to secure borders against the North Vietnamese army, then you don't have enough people to watch out for the Viet Cong, and the guerrilla tactics are going to ensue, and you're going to lose your territory. On the same side of the token, if you also focus more on fighting against the Viet Cong and using counterinsurgency to fight against guerrilla tactics that the Viet Cong is using, then you don't have enough people to secure the border, and then the North Vietnamese army is going to come in and take the land back. So that's kind of the dilemma here, right? How do you balance between fighting the Viet Cong and also the North Vietnamese army? Because it's two different types of tactics. You've got the Viet Cong using guerrilla warfare, and you've got the North Vietnamese army that you also have to fight against. So how do you do both, right? That's Westmoreland's dilemma. How do you balance between counterinsurgency and conventional sweeps to secure borders? Next, we have the Tet Offensive. It was successful, however, it was a huge blow to U.S. morale. So what that means is on the home front, whenever the public found out about what was happening in the Tet Offensive and how brutal it was, a lot of people, mostly everybody, was against the war in Vietnam, and people were calling for a quick withdrawal of U.S. out of Vietnam because of everything that was happening to all the grisly, terrible things that were happening. So, as a result of that blow to U.S. morale after the Tet Offensive, the United States decided to reduce their commitment to being in Vietnam and fighting against North Vietnam, and they started peace negotiations as a result of the blow to the U.S. morale that happened after the Tet Offensive. As for Creighton Abrams, he comes in. He had some good success with using counterinsurgency and fighting against the Viet Cong. However, there were a lot bigger problems, right? You've got problems with. We can come down here and see exactly what they want you to know. The Vietnam's army problems. Their morale was low. They had poor training and poor leadership. The government was corrupt, fragile, and they were completely dependent on the United States. That's the big problem here. South Vietnam couldn't really stand on their own. They were completely dependent on the United States. So if the U.S. withdrew, then South Vietnam was going to be no more because they can't hold their own without the U.S. And this is because of their low morale, low training, and poor leadership at this point. So even though Creighton Abrams, under his command, there was a lot of success going on with counterinsurgency, was it really worth it? Because basically the Vietnamese army couldn't stand on their own without the United States holding them up constantly and propping them up. So was this really a sustainable war? So then there's the 1971 Laos incursion, and it used troops from the South Vietnam Army, but it was a bad result, and it was a bad sign for Vietnamization. So we just talked about in the last lot about how the Vietnam Army can't hold up on their own. The South Vietnam Army, our allies at this time, couldn't hold up on their own. It kind of proved it in 1971 whenever they went into Laos, and the South Vietnamese Army did terribly. And it showed just how non-sustainable the South Vietnamese Army was, and how much of a non-sustainable war this was. How was it really worth everything we were doing? Because without the U.S. constantly propping up South Vietnam, they weren't going to do very well on their own. Next, there was a conscious decision not to activate the Guard and reserve for Vietnam. A very small group of Guard soldiers, reserve soldiers, were activated in Vietnam, but the vast majority of them stayed home. This is because the president didn't want people asking questions about what was going on, why the Guard was being activated, were things going bad. He didn't want it to make it seem to the public like things were getting out of hand and he didn't have control over the situation. So he made a conscious decision not to activate the Guard and reserve for Vietnam. For Vietnam, there was a reliance upon multiple one-year tours by regulars and upon the draft, which led to a huge problem in terms of training and leadership. So basically for Vietnam, everybody served for 1 year, and then they came back home and they were replaced by different people who also served 1 year. So the problem here for a long war like Vietnam, with each person only serving 1 year and then being switched out, there's poor training, poor experience, everyone's inexperienced. As soon as somebody gets a year of experience, they're replaced by somebody new. And so they had to be retrained, new people had to be trained again, and everybody's inexperienced. So because of this rule about the 1 year tour by regulars, it was a huge strain on training all these people and on leadership, right? So you have kind of inexperienced soldiers fighting because of this short term for their tours. The testable takeaway here to focus on is that for domestic political reasons, the U.S. leaders decided not to mobilize the Guard for the war because, like I said, they didn't want to raise questions about why the Guard had to be activated and why the reserve forces had to be tapped into to go to Vietnam, because that kind of makes it seem like things are getting out of control, which they were. But for political reasons, they did not want the public to get an idea of just how bad things were going, because the Guard and the Reserve had to be tapped into. So they refrained from activating the Guard to send them overseas. That's kind of everything we just talked about. For the third bullet, we're going to go into detail about this because it is testable. They use something known as the revolving door effect of individuals rotating in and out of units. That kind of hurt their cohesion because, like I said, lack of experience, right? As soon as somebody gets 1 year of experience, they get replaced by somebody new. And so this revolving door leads to people that are inexperienced, and the units aren't very cohesive because people don't really get to know each other for a very long period of time, right? It's constantly just new people coming in and out. That also led to a constant demand for replacements, which undermined training programs and the standards of the training programs. So when you have to constantly be training new people, it puts huge demands on training, which inevitably leads to a lowering of training standards and undermines the training programs. And as a result of these two things, there was a poor quality of leadership, which led to bad consequences in Vietnam. Next, we have a lot of bad stuff happening in Vietnam. U.S. soldiers getting out of control, doing things that are highly illegal. A lot of really unfortunate things happened in Vietnam to the Vietnamese people while the United States was there, and this is attributed to leadership failures. So if you remember, there's no such thing as bad teams, only bad leaders. So this went on not only the failure of the U.S. soldiers, but also the failure of their leaders while they were in Vietnam. So some examples that are important to know are Firebase Mary Ann. It was really bad event that happened due to lack of discipline from U.S. soldiers. A lot of civilians were harmed, which really hurt morale on the domestic front. People didn't really support the war. For all the examples of soldier misconduct, understand that it's attributed to leadership failures among officers, and NCOs were the most important factor for this breakdown of moral and ethics and these travesties that happened. For Firebase Mary Ann, just understand that it was a base that fell due to poor leadership. Then for My Lai, it was due to a bunch of U.S. soldiers killing a lot of civilians, and it was a travesty, a really horrible event that happened. But what's important to know here for the test is that this is attributed to poor leadership. Poor leadership, because there's no such thing as poor teams, only poor leaders. Alright, next. The Guard, back at home, same thing, didn't always handle unrest very well. So the example is the Kent State shooting. So back home on the domestic front, there was a lot of social tension, and because of that, the Guard had to be activated to get things under control. But the Guard didn't always do well. At Kent State University, whenever there was a lot of unrest, the Guard opened fire and killed some civilians when they were trying to get things under control, and that's in it. So the Kent State shooting is an example of how the Guard didn't always handle things very well during this time period. Next, so after Vietnam, some reforms happened. There was a new emphasis on training, discipline, professionalism, and pride instead of laxity after the horrible things that happened at My Lai, and after Mary Ann, the fire base, fell. They realized that they needed to emphasize professionalism and pride in being a soldier and discourage laxness. Also, there was a huge emphasis on better training and better discipline for the U.S. Army. There was also a dramatic increase in roles for women in the Army, so now women have more roles in the Army after Vietnam. And then there's something called total force. Total force meant that from that point on after Vietnam, the Guard and the Reserve had greater roles in combat and combat support deployments. These pie charts at the bottom here just show the dramatic increase after Vietnam and how much the Guard and Reserve forces were used in combat and in combat support. That's known as total force. Total force because now you're including the Guard and Reserve along with regular Army, so it's a total force. Alright, so emphasizing what's important to know. Did the National Guard units fight in France? Alright, that's a review from before. We know that already. We already did those. And then these. Did the Guard deal with domestic disturbances and security threats from the 50s through the 70s? Yes, they did. Did it handle all smoothly and under state, not federal authority? No, it did not always handle things smoothly, and they were under federal authority at this point. The federal government had control over the Guard, but the Guard didn't always handle things smoothly. Next, was the Guard's role in Vietnam limited? Yes, it was limited. Did this state of affairs help inspire the total force policy? Yes, it did. Total force meaning after Vietnam, the Guard and Reserve are more included in combat and combat support. So, greater role. The Guard and Reserves have a greater role in U.S. Army combat and combat support functions per the total force policy. Alright, next. After Vietnam, some more reforms happened. We have realistic combat training, like NTC. Know that NTC is a type of realistic combat training, where the training actually deals with what you'll see in the environment overseas. They deal with realistic combat situations and settings, scenarios. That way, soldiers have some experience before they go overseas. That was NTC. That is an example of the realistic combat training reforms that happened after Vietnam. So here we see a better emphasis on training after Vietnam. Also, air-land battle. Air-land battle happened in the 1980s. It was an example of post-Vietnam reforms and how they were better emphasizing training and readiness. An air-land battle is an offensive-minded doctrine. So air-land battle is all about being proactive, training U.S. Army soldiers for an offensive-minded doctrine. So we can look here in the notes and see exactly what's important to emphasize about this. What's testable here is that General Starry introduced air-land battle doctrine, which was more offensive-oriented, and was also more flexible in handling the Soviet threat than active defense had been. So, for air-land battle, we have a shift from being actively on defense, and now we're taking a more proactive, aggressive stance to fight the Soviets. That's the air-land battle, and it's an offensive-minded doctrine. Alright, next. For the air-land battle, understand that it used mass, maneuver, and offensive. And it's really important that we do look at the notes here to understand what's important to know about here. Understand that this is made possible due to new technology like tanks and helicopters. So tanks and helicopters are the weapons that they're using to make the air-land battle technique possible. And understand that the air-land battle technique uses mass, maneuver, and offensive because it's an aggressive, more proactive mindset in the battlefield. So for the testable part of what you should know here, air-land battle and principles of war, the slide shows a rough, simple depiction where the blue is the American units and the red would be the Soviet units. As for offensive, meaning seize, retain, and exploit the initiative, the blue arrows here are striking Soviet follow-on forces that are so the red squares at the back where the blue arrows are pointing to, those are reinforcements from the Soviets, and here we see, due to the use of helicopters and tanks, the U.S. Army is going around and attacking the reinforcements before they're able to reinforce the Soviets' forces. So that's why offensive is a principle of war that's being used here, because you are seizing, retaining, and exploiting an initiative. You're seizing on the reinforcements that the Soviets are sending in. You are retaining control of the battlefield, and you are exploiting their weakness because they will not be able to send reinforcements if you're using technology like helicopters and tanks to take out their reinforcements. So offensive is one of the principles of war that is used in the air-land battle technique. As for maneuver, they were using tanks and helicopters to strategically place their enemies, in this case the Soviets, in a disadvantageous position. So let's say, for example, at the low end of the battlefield. They had the low ground. They would put them in a valley, for example, where they were spread out and had their flanks vulnerable, and where they were not able to flank the American forces, as an example of how air-land battle uses the principle of warfare for maneuver. Alright, so that's offensive and maneuver. As for mass, you're concentrating all the effects of combat power at the decisive place and time. So air-land battle uses mass because these helicopters and tanks were concentrating all their firepower into the decisive area, in this case on the reinforcements, and also on the main fighting force to reduce the enemy's combat power. So you've got offensive, wiping out the reinforcements so that way the forces shrink by attrition. You've got maneuver because the tanks and helicopters are really good at pushing your enemy into a disadvantageous location, like being at the low ground, on lower ground, or in a valley, someplace where they aren't able to flank the U.S., someplace where their own flanks are susceptible to fire. So just using tanks and helicopters basically to funnel and push your enemy where you want them to be on the battlefield, where they're in a disadvantageous position. And then, of course, mass, because if you're using helicopters and tanks on the battlefield, then you can concentrate all your firepower where it's going to hurt your enemy the worst. Alright, so that's air-land battle. Very offensive, very aggressive type of mindset on the battlefield, basically. Alright, so did the Tet Offensive victory boost U.S. morale? So the Tet Offensive was a victory for the United States, but it actually hurt U.S. morale because it was so aggressive and so brutal. A lot of really horrible things happened. People at home started protesting Vietnam, and support for the war back home shrank drastically after the Tet Offensive happened because of how brutal it was in Vietnam. Nevertheless, General Abrams was able to improve counterinsurgency a little bit. They had some success with counterinsurgency and fighting against the Viet Cong. And given operations like the Laos incursion, was Vietnamization successful? No, it was not. So the Laos incursion happened whenever the South Vietnam Army went into Laos trying to take it and get this under control, and they failed, and it was terrible. And it showed just how helpless South Vietnam was without the United States, and how this wasn't a very sustainable war, because even if we did help South Vietnam, they wouldn't be able to stand on their own anyway without our help. So it kind of showed how much of a failure Vietnamization was. Then, for events like the My Lai atrocity and Firebase Mary Ann, was this defeat due only to poorly trained soldiers on one-year tours? So no, it wasn't. That probably was a contributing factor. However, the main factor here is poor leadership. Remember, no such thing as poor teams, only poor leaders. So officer leadership was a huge factor in atrocities like the My Lai massacre and also the fall of the Firebase Mary Ann. Next, did post-Vietnam reforms include the following? More roles for women? Yes. Women had greater roles after Vietnam. Was there an emphasis upon professionalism? Yes, there was more of an emphasis on professionalism, and they were trying to fight against laxity in the U.S. Army after Vietnam. For training venues like the National Training Center or the NTC, remember the NTC, the National Training Center, was all about giving realistic combat situations and training for soldiers. So it's putting them in a scenario, in an environment that would be very similar to the type of situation they would be in overseas. And so the National Training Center, or NTC, was giving realistic training to soldiers after Vietnam to prepare them better, so they'd be better experienced by the time they went overseas. That's a post-Vietnam reform. Next, the post-Vietnam air-land battle doctrine emphasized defensive or the offensive more. So remember, the air-land battle emphasized offensive more. Air-land battle is very offensive. It uses mass maneuver and offensive principles of war. Did it emphasize maneuver and timing-related aspect of mass, more or less? Yes, it did. It used maneuver and mass. Also, it used offensive, right? We talked about why in that previous line. So that's it for lesson 7, and now we can move on to lesson 8. So for lesson 8, we will start off talking about Operation Just Cause in Panama, 1989. This showed really good improvements in night fighting technology. They fought this battle typically at night to gain the element of surprise, and they used new night fighting technology like goggles, binoculars that can see at night, and all that technology, and also training from the NTC in realistic settings paid off. They did very well during Operation Just Cause in Panama whenever they were removing this brutal dictator. And they were able to use the element of surprise because they were able to fight at night, and they were very successful at doing so. Also, No Grenada, 1983. This was a joint operation snafu. Snafu basically meaning chaos. So there was chaos trying to coordinate joint operations between Navy, Army, Air Force, and this is due to poor unity of command. So a lot of different people giving commands. There was poor unity of commands. There was also bad communication and poor logistical support during Grenada. However, after Grenada, it helped to spur passage. It was called the Goldwater-Nichols Act. And its Goldwater-Nichols Act is very important. Just to summarize what's important about it, it created theater unity of command. So now we've got greater unity of command. We got commands and orders coming from, and decisions coming from one source. And that's what's so important about Goldwater-Nichols Act. It created better unity of command on the battlefield. The U.S. Army is doing things a little bit differently now, so now they have greater unity of command thanks to the Goldwater-Nichols Act. Alright, as for Operation Desert Storm, there was no deployment logistical plan, but it was successful in spite of glitches and shortfalls. So, what they're saying here is that there was a lot of technology that was coming out now, new technology, right? Because we're in the 90s now. And, however, unfortunately, you need really sophisticated, intricate, detailed, thorough logistical planning when using these types of new high technology weapons and systems on the battlefield. However, during Operation Desert Shield, there was not a deployment logistical plan, even though they needed one. However, that did lead to a lot of glitches and shortfalls. However, it was a successful operation. There was Guard involvement, because this is post-Vietnam, right? So we're getting the Guard involved in combat situations now, and in overseas deployments. Schwarzkopf enjoyed unity of command during Operation Desert Shield, and why would that be? It's because of the Goldwater-Nichols Act, which creates greater theater unity of command. And it showed during Operation Desert Shield, where Schwarzkopf, the general here, had great unity of command, and that is what is attributing to the success of Operation Desert Shield, even though they had no deployment logistical plan, but high technology that required logistical planning, but it was still successful thanks to the Goldwater-Nichols Act, which gave General Schwarzkopf a greater unity of command on the battlefield. Next, we've got the air campaign used to blind and disrupt Iraqi armed forces during Kuwait, the fight for Kuwait. This was Schwarzkopf's plan, an example of how his unity of command was improved from the Goldwater-Nichols Act. What's testable here, to emphasize, the air campaign started before the ground campaign. Schwarzkopf ran the air campaign for weeks before committing to ground forces. So here you use some of the principles of war, like massing all your combat power at the decisive place, right? If you use air campaigns for a while before ground campaigns, then you kind of enhance the security, another principle of warfare, for ground forces. Next, the air campaign preceded the ground campaign. We talked about that, right? Something that is kind of a tidbit, but something that is testable here, is to understand that during Operation Desert Storm, because the National Guard was getting more involved in combat, there was an example where the Iraqis were able to kill a good number of National Guard soldiers that were within a quartermaster unit, even though they used this strategic air campaign to enhance security of the area before sending in ground forces. Unfortunately, there were a good number of guardsmen and women that did die in a quartermaster unit, so be aware of that. As for Operation Desert Storm, we see the principles of mass, surprise, maneuver, unity of command, and economy of force. So we're going to go one by one in the notes here and emphasize what's important about each one. So testable for the principles that were used well in Desert Storm, we've got mass, surprise, maneuver, unity of command, and economy of force. As far as mass, they were concentrating combat power at the decisive place and time because they were using air campaigns, so they were using airborne technology, airborne infantry, air mobile divisions to enhance security. They were also using tanks, new tank technology to concentrate firepower where it would really hurt the enemy the most. Better unity of command from Schwarzkopf thanks to the Goldwater-Nichols Act. Economy of force, because you are strategically placing, you're allocating minimum essential combat power to secondary efforts. So what does that mean? It means that you're basically putting a small group of people to support the larger goal, the larger task, which would have the greater number of people. So you're basically strategically placing better numbers of people according to which task is the most important or most challenging task. So you're just, economy is the word used here because you're trying to be strategic and you're being wise about where you're placing units and what size units you're placing in that area. So basically just the stuff we've been talking about for the last 8 lessons. Understand that for Desert Storm it used mass, surprise, maneuver, unity of command, and economy of force, thanks in part to the Goldwater-Nichols Act giving unity of command and also new technology in the form of tanks and helicopters and better flying technology. Next we have a battle in Somalia. So for Somalia, understand that it was in a really bad situation due to warlords taking over. The state was failing, a lot of famine, a lot of starving people. So the United States, along with United Nations, decided to start delivering food. However, whenever warlords are taking over and the state is crumbling and warlords are tearing the situation apart even worse and tearing the country apart. Inevitably, even if you're just trying to deliver food, inevitably you're going to have to get into combat situations. And then those combat situations escalate. And that leads to increased combat. And the U.S. was doing pretty well in fighting against these warlords and against all these insurgents in Somalia. However, the media didn't make it seem that way, right? So because the media showed all the horrible things happening in Somalia and how the U.S. was fighting in Somalia, even though they just originally wanted to go and bring food to starving people and things were getting out of hand, the media helped to raise a lot of public outrage against what was happening in Somalia, because why are we now fighting these people whenever we were originally just trying to bring them food, right? Why are things getting so out of hand? And so because there was so much public outrage about what was happening in Somalia, the U.S. ended up withdrawing from Somalia. Then we have Haiti, completely different situation. In Haiti, we had to go in to replace a bad dictator and replace him with a democratically elected leader. There were a lot of tensions when this happened, but eventually the new government was able to secure its power, and it was a pretty peaceful process. So Haiti was a little bit more positive. We went in, we replaced a bad dictator with a democratically elected leader, and then the government, it was a little rocky at first, but it ended up standing up on itself, on its own, and it was mostly peaceful in Haiti. Understand the difference between Haiti and Somalia. And then we have Bosnia. In Bosnia slash Herzegovina, the U.S. Army was part of a multinational force sent after accords to maintain peace. So things were pretty much already under control in Bosnia, Herzegovina, and then the U.S. Army went in after things were under control just to make sure that they stayed under control. And there was really not much fighting here at all. This was pretty peaceful, simple, straightforward operation. So it's important for the test to know the differences between what happened in Somalia, Haiti, and Bosnia. Same conditions? No. For the U.S., did they have the same aims and approach to handle the situation? No. Same results? No. So, for conditions, in Somalia, there were warlords that were tearing it up. It was a terrible place to live. We went in to bring food. That was our original aim, but inevitably we ended up having to fight against the warlords and the insurgents, and we ended up having to withdraw, and Somalia was still in chaos whenever we left. So to summarize, in the notes here we have, Somalia was in chaos. Haiti had leadership problems. They had a bad dictator, but they still had a government, even though it was a bad government. And in Bosnia, things were already stable by a peace accord, and we just went in to make sure that they stayed peaceful. As for the aims and approach, in Somalia, the aims evolved, right? We started off just bringing food, and inevitably we got our hands dirty. We had to get involved with violence, and we had to fight against the warlords there. In Haiti, the U.S. just was there to oversee the new placement of a democratically elected leader to replace the bad dictator that was there, and this was a pretty peaceful, simple operation. It happened pretty peacefully and was successful. And then in Bosnia, U.S. and other forces just oversaw a peace that was already achieved. So we're just pretty much making sure things stay peaceful in Bosnia. Also, not the same results. The U.S. left Somalia. Like I said, they withdrew, and it was still in chaos. When we withdrew, we didn't really fix things in Somalia, unfortunately. As for Haiti, when we left Haiti, it was stable. And then Bosnia, when we left there, they remained stable for a while, all the way up until the early 2000s. So in Bosnia and Haiti, whenever we left it in a stable state. But for Somalia, whenever we left Somalia, we left it in chaos still. We didn't really help because we had to withdraw. Next, for the Kosovo air campaign, the U.S. Army Task Force Hawks had some problems, and it supported transformation initiatives like the brigade combat teams. So Task Force Hawk didn't see much combat. It was a huge failure right away. They didn't even get to see any combat. It was kind of large, clunky, difficult to deal with. It wasn't very flexible, right? So instead, we have this transformation initiative like the brigade combat teams. The brigade combat teams were smaller, more easily deployable, more flexible. They could be moved more. So, specifically to know for the test, we're going to go over these notes. Task Force Hawk was a U.S. Army Apache attack helicopter force which deployed to support the air campaign. It encountered a number of high-profile problems in its deployment, and it didn't even see any combat because there were so many problems, because it was hard to support these new Black Hawk helicopters that we weren't used to yet. Some of Hawk's problems were due to the Army's own making. Hawk was supposed to be quick, expedient operation instead of using Cold War style big unit deployments, but the Army was still set up for using big unit deployments. We weren't really set up yet for using quick, expedient operations. We had no experience using quick, expedient operations like Black Hawks yet. We were still used to Cold War style big unit fighting. For the fourth bullet, Hawk's problems helped push the Army toward what the U.S. Army Chief of Staff called transformation. Perhaps the best example of his transformation-related reforms is the Brigade Combat Team, which is a more deployable standalone unit for expeditionary operations like the one Task Force Hawk had been assigned. So, summation here, they did something called the Transformation Initiative, which led them to the Brigade Combat Teams, which is a more deployable standalone unit used for quick operations like the one that Task Force Hawk was supposed to deal with. So the Brigade Combat Team essentially is just used for quick, expedient operations, and they can be deployed very quickly. That's the Brigade Combat Team, which we learned that lesson thanks to the failure of the U.S. Army Task Force Hawk's problems. So did problems at Grenada help inspire the Goldwater-Nichols Act? Yes. We needed better unity of command in theaters. Did that act in turn help guarantee in-theater unity of command in Operation Desert Storm? Yes, it did. As for new technologies and new weapons, did night vision devices help night fighting in Panama? Yes, night fighting technology did help with the fighting in Panama. Was anything said about technology's role in logistical planning for Desert Shield, or was there even a plan? So we needed high degree of logistical planning for Desert Shield because we had so much new, sophisticated technology being used. However, they admitted there was not really much of a plan in terms of logistical planning. Nevertheless, it was successful thanks to the unity of command that was used from the Goldwater-Nichols Act. Then for Operation Desert Storm, did new weapons help firepower mass? Absolutely. For Desert Storm, now we've got tank technology, we've got really sophisticated helicopters, and they also helped maneuver for that reason, because when you have tanks and helicopters, it really helps you to move your enemy into strategic positions where they have a lack of advantage. 1990s, did U.S. operations in Somalia, Haiti, and Bosnia encounter the same conditions, same approach, and same results? No. So in Somalia, we went in bringing food because there were warlords tearing the place apart. We inevitably got involved in some combat, and then we had to withdraw because people at home were so mad that we got involved with combat at Somalia and things got out of hand. So we left Somalia in chaos, just like when we arrived. In Haiti, we had to replace a dictator with a democratically elected leader, and this was a pretty peaceful process. It happened pretty simply, and we left Haiti with a better government. In Bosnia, peace was already established. The U.S. just went in to ensure that peace stayed that way, to make sure that things continued to progress smoothly. However, this ended in the 2000s, but this is a pretty good track, right? So Bosnia stayed under control up until the early 2000s. So it was a success. Was Task Force Hawk's deployment smooth? Did it achieve combat success in Kosovo? No, it didn't. It was a terrible deployment, and they didn't even see any combat in Kosovo. Did Hawk help inspire Army transformation measures like brigade combat teams? Yes, it did. Remember, brigade combat teams were more deployable, and they were ideally meant to deal with quick, expedient operations. As for Homeland Security and the Heavy Guard involvement, we're going to get into that. After 9/11, we see Homeland Security ramping up, and this is thanks in part to a heavy involvement from the National Guard. As for U.S. Special Forces, they worked very well with Northern Alliances and other rebel forces during the initial operations in Afghanistan. So understand that the U.S. Special Forces played a critical role in helping the initial operations in Afghanistan. For Mountain and other operations success, understand that during battles like that, what happened in the Operation Mountain and other operations, there was a lot of success. We did pretty well fighting against the Taliban, but it wasn't a complete success. Just like whenever we were fighting the Viet Cong, we're fighting the Taliban, and they tend to scurry, run away, and they hide in places like Pakistani sanctuaries, and then they come back later after things calm down, and they take back the land. So we did manage to kill a lot of Taliban during operations like Mountain and other operations. However, it wasn't completely successful because still some Taliban escaped and went and hid in Pakistani sanctuaries. As for the U.S. force, the U.S. force was the biggest Western force, but we still had a low size. Even though we were the biggest Western force, the size was still low for the U.S. force for operations in Afghanistan. For the operations in Afghanistan invasion, it used mass, surprise, offensive, and economy of force. And these reasons are pretty much the same for all the other battles we've talked about so far. What's testable is that Tommy Franks used mass in the invasions in Afghanistan, mostly because you're using technology like helicopters and tanks to mass firepower, what's going to hurt the Taliban the most. You also use surprise, same thing, because the Taliban didn't know what the hell to do whenever they saw these high-tech helicopters and tanks coming after them. So that was quite the surprise for them. Also, they kind of did things strategically where they came in from areas that the Taliban had no idea they were going to be coming in from using these helicopters and tanks. So just understand that operations in Afghanistan used mass, surprise, offensive, and economy of force. Maneuver is pretty obvious. You can look at the areas on the map and see that they were using these tanks and helicopters to place the Taliban in positions where they did not have the advantage on the battlefield. As for offensive, we were seizing, retaining, and exploiting initiatives by hitting the Taliban where it hurt them most and gaining decisive territory, gaining decisive lands. And then for economy of force, same thing. Don't go into much detail here for the test. Just understand that we were placing units where they were most needed strategically, and we were dedicating the majority of firepower to the most decisive locations. Basically, the most important thing to know here is just which principles were used. For the operations in Afghanistan, we used mass, surprise, offensive, and economy of force. Next, for special operations, they played a big role supporting advances in other areas. Offensive was used thanks to what was known as thunder runs. Thunder runs was just a battle tactic that they used that was really effective, and it was effective in part mostly due to all the weapons technology that they had at the time. Saddam's special forces used suicide type attacks and ambushes. They usually failed, but one succeeded against the support unit. What's important to know about that is that even though things like thunder runs were really successful, and we clearly had the superiority in terms of technology, and we were really doing pretty well in Afghanistan, it didn't stop Saddam's forces, even though they had the underhand and they didn't know how to deal with technology. They would still do suicide attacks, and one time it was successful. So understand that even though we had the upper hand here on the battlefield, it didn't stop Saddam's forces. They still attempted suicide attacks against the United States and the U.S. forces. And at one point in time, one of these suicide attacks was successful. Did the U.S. launch air campaigns well before ground operations in Desert Storm and the operations in Afghanistan? Yes, they did. So we're using air campaigns before ground operations in Desert Storm and operations in Afghanistan, which is very helpful. Did the U.S. achieve surprise in both Desert Storm and the operations in Afghanistan? Yes. Yes, the U.S. did achieve surprise in both. How about economy of force and mass? Yes and yes. We used economy of force, we used mass, we used surprise, and this is thanks in part to the fact that we're using air campaigns well before ground operations, and that surprised them. It also used economy of force, where you're putting minimal force to support a primary force. And then we use mass because we're concentrating firepower where it's going to hurt the enemy the worst. Did the U.S. make aggressive use of offensive in the operations in Afghanistan invasion? Yes. Yes, we did use aggressive use of offensive. Thunder runs are a good example of that. So thunder runs are an example of how we were aggressively using the principle of offensive in the operations in Afghanistan. Were the Iraqi regulars so intimidated that they did not strike U.S. combat arms or support units? No, right? They were very foolhardy and they attempted suicide style attacks against combat arms and support units, and they were pretty much all failures except for one time they were successful. So that's what's important to know about that. Did American Special Forces play a big role in overthrowing the Taliban government in Afghanistan? Yes. Did they play a big role in the operations in Afghanistan invasion? Yes, they did. In mountain operations with Afghan forces in 2004, did U.S. forces achieve success? Yeah, pretty much. However, they couldn't exploit it, right? Because, first off, the U.S. force size was small, relatively small. Even though we were the most prevalent force in Afghanistan, our force size was relatively small. So we couldn't exploit these victories due to sanctuaries in Pakistan where the Taliban would run to and hide and wait the U.S. out. And then once the U.S. kind of pulled away from fighting, then the Taliban could come back, right? So it wasn't a complete success because some Taliban were able to escape and hide until it was safe for them to come back out. So you can't get all the Taliban because they're able to hide in Pakistan sanctuaries. There was a fractured Iraqi society and government afterwards, and U.S. forces received a weak welcome. The factions undermined the stability of Iraq. These are the Sunnis, the Shiites, the Kurds, and other outsiders, which are undermining the stability of Iraq. And because of that, when the U.S. came into Iraq, they received a very weak welcome. Due to the small U.S. force size, they did not retain legitimacy. They were too small to be able to achieve the goals they had set out, basically, is what that's saying. There was high infrastructure repair and security demands, and they didn't have enough people to oversee all of that. in Afghanistan because of all the demands they had with repairing infrastructure and establishing security against the Taliban. There were also, to make things worse, bad policies set out by leaders that were trying to bring order to the area. The bad policies also hurt legitimacy. The policies, for example, trying to get people back to work and help the economy, were failures, and they were not doing very good with establishing policies to retain order, and that led to also hurting legitimacy. Then through 2004, there were United States tactical victories in all of the fights they were fighting except for Samara. So understand Samara. Samara is an exception to where the U.S. was making tactical victories in all their fights. Samara, there was not a tactical victory from the U.S. They did not experience victory in Samara. Here we talked about whack-a-mole. The Iraqi security forces could not secure United States gains, the example being Samara. So the U.S. would go in and gain some territory for Iraq. However, Iraqi security was not able to hold those gains. They could not exploit those gains. And so the U.S. units had to move from crisis to crisis, basically like whack-a-mole, right? The U.S. goes in, wins some territory over, and then they move somewhere else to gain more territory, but that territory they just left gets refilled by the Taliban and taken over again. So now the U.S. has to go back. And so the U.S. was constantly moving from crisis to crisis because of their small size. They couldn't hold all the land at once. They would have to move from one area to the next. And at the same time, the Iraqi security forces were not very competent, so they couldn't hold the land that the U.S. was gaining for them. Then in 2005, the elections seemed to go well. However, there was a bad Sunni turnout, which led to a lot of violence afterwards between the Sunni extremists against the Shiite extremists. So now different extremists in Iraq are fighting, and it kind of hints that there's going to be a civil war break out. So more problems happening there, which led to a strain on U.S. Army and its National Guard. Because remember, after Vietnam, National Guard is getting more involved with combat and combat support operations. So what's important to know here, we talked about these already. From Desert Storm onward, did post-Cold War commitments increase Guard involvement in overseas deployments? Yes, it did. And did that include combat and its risks? Yes, it did include combat and risks, because we see the example of Guard units and a lot of people in certain units dying. So now, after the 2005 election, the tensions between the Sunni and the Shiites, there's going to be a civil war between Iraqi factions, basically. So now there's more stuff happening. We have new counterinsurgency doctrine that re-embraced lessons abandoned after Vietnam. We have an increased emphasis on political and social factors along with kinetic combat skills. So what's important to know here is that while we have the need to emphasize kinetic combat skills, basically combat that's mobile, moving around, using counterinsurgency to fight guerrilla warfare type tactics, we also have to be mindful of political and social factors. Just like what happened in Vietnam, where political and social factors played a huge role. Morale back home, for example, declined after the Tet Offensive, so that's an example of how social factors had to be emphasized when fighting. Also, politically, of course, you have to be mindful of politics when fighting. So now you're coupling political and social factors along with kinetic combat skills. So let's go into the notes here to emphasize what's important here, because this is summarized a lot in the slide. So what's tested about the first bullet? Sectarian violence soared in 2006 for Iraq. One called it a near civil war, especially between Sunnis and Shiites in Samara. Remember, that was a failure, unfortunately, in Samara. For the second bullet, That's testable on the slide, the one at the very bottom. We'll read about that. Testable, second sub-bullet at the bottom here. After Vietnam, the Army largely abandoned counterinsurgency lessons learned in Vietnam, but that the new COIN doctrine which guided the surge reincorporated them. One lesson was that COIN involved more than just kinetic combat operations, right? You got to do more than just move around and fight the insurgents and fight against guerrilla tactics. You also have to be mindful, like I said, of political and social factors. All right? The lesson we learned from Vietnam, we now have to apply to the civil wars going on in the Iraqi factions, and when we're fighting in Iraq. Then we started working with more reliable Iraqi allies, which helped us. Right now, we're not just working with the poor security forces in Iraq. Now we're reaching out. We're gaining help from more reliable Iraqi allies. Understand that when we go back to Afghanistan between 2005 2009, we had weak NATO allied effort. Also, the insurgencies, Pakistan sanctuaries remained there that were hiding all the Taliban, which was a huge challenge. The Afghan government was weak and also filled with corruption, which was another huge challenge to fight against. And there were resurgent Taliban, right? The Taliban kept resurging because they kept hiding out in these Pakistan sanctuaries and coming back after the U.S. fighting would stop. So you can't really stop Taliban altogether. They are like scurrying away, hiding in sanctuaries, and coming back first chance they get. So limited success in that way. So the first selection, about 2003, when the U.S. entered and first occupied Iraq, did nearly all Iraqis greet U.S. troops eagerly? No. Right? They had a poor welcome whenever U.S. went into Iraq because of all the factions that were there, like the Sunnis, the Shiites. So they did not receive a warm welcome when they went to Iraq in 2003. Did Iraqi factions undermine stability? Yes. There was so much fighting between all the different factions in Iraq, like the Sunnis and the Shiites and other outsiders, that stability was heavily undermined in Iraq. Were U.S. forces ample enough, and were policies like Bremer's locally popular enough to boost U.S. legitimacy? So no. So once we got to Iraq, U.S. legitimacy plummeted because policies from Bremer were failing in Iraq, and the U.S. forces were too small to maintain legitimacy. Then from 2004 to 2006, as things went bad, then seemed to improve, and then went to pieces. In 2004, could the Iraqi government exploit tactical victories that the U.S. forces won at places like Samarra? No, they couldn't. Samarra was a failure, and the Iraqi government could not exploit tactical victories that the U.S. made. Then, in 2005, did the elections have omens of the near civil war that erupted in 2006? Yes, the 2005 elections did have omens of the near civil war that erupted. The omens were that there was a poor turnout, the Sunnis didn't vote, and there was a lot of tension between the Sunnis and the Shiites. Those were some kind of foreshadowings, examples in 2005 that a civil war was going to break out in 2006. Then, as for the surge, did the U.S. Army's COIN doctrine reflect a long-term embrace of Vietnam's lessons? Yes, it did, because now we are putting together kinetic combat skills along with political and social awareness. Did this doctrine emphasize kinetic combat over working with locals? No, right? It married the two. So now we've got kinetic combat in addition to working with locals. During the surge, did U.S. forces work with Iraqi groups and or the government who were more reliable allies? Yes. So we did start working with more reliable allies of Iraq. Regarding later developments in Afghanistan, did the U.S. have aggressive NATO allies? No. The U.S. had weak NATO allies. Did it eliminate the Pakistani sanctuary? No. The Pakistani sanctuaries still stood and still persevered and hid all these Taliban. Was there an increasingly strong Afghan government to end a Taliban revival and secured most of Afghanistan? No. So the Afghan government was weak, and the Taliban kept reviving. They kept persisting by hiding in sanctuaries and coming back. We couldn't get rid of them all, and Afghanistan was not secured.